Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. This week our guest is Dr. Prash Paspanathan. Dr. Prash is a co-founder of Enosis Therapeutics, an Australia-based medical technology and research company. They are pioneering the introduction of virtual reality into the psychedelic therapy space. Dr. Prash is also the founder of pioneering digital currency brokerage Caleb and Brown, which is bringing cryptocurrency into the suite of traditional wealth management services. Dr. Prash is currently on the board of the Northern Center for Contemporary Art. His donation to the NCCA in the form of carbon-neutral Bitcoin was the world's first cryptocurrency donation to a public art gallery. Thank you, Dr. Prash, for being on the show. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Thank you for having me.
So you conducted the world's first study on the synergistic application of virtual reality and psychedelics.
So I'm a psychiatrist by background. I did psychiatry purely to work with psychedelics. Psychedelics was what led me to crypto, is what led me to psychiatry. And over the last 3 years, I've been building with my research partner this project called Enosis Therapeutics, which combines or investigates the synergistic effect of virtual reality and psychedelics. So it is using virtual reality as a therapeutic tool, as a means of optimizing and modulating the psychedelic therapy experience.
Wow.
Broadly speaking, if you look at innovation in the psychedelic space today, most of the innovation is focused on drug development, drug discovery. Everyone's trying to produce another psilocybin analog, mushroom analog. But the psychedelic therapy process involves a huge range of elements, mostly human-centered elements, like the context, like the therapist. And there's really not that much innovation going into that, which seems like the points that we should target. And that's what we have been targeting. And virtual reality has been our principal tool at this point to target that.
So let me ask you, so is somebody taking on this kind of, I guess you're meeting with individuals who either are experiencing, they're experiencing some kind of mental health crisis, whether that's PTSD or any of the numerous mental issues that people could have during what could be considered a very traumatic period of the planet and the human species. Are you... Is this the kind of thing where I'm in a room with a therapist and I'm taking a microdose or a full dose? And then at what point am I putting on the goggles and what am I experiencing? Am I reliving a childhood experience? Am I seeing lights and kind of sounds that are then going to kind of move me in a certain way? And then is the therapist talking to me during the whole process? Walk me through that.
Yes. So we work entirely in the therapeutic space. And psychedelic therapy consists broadly of 3 phases. There's the preparation phase, where you're assessed for suitability and you're prepared for the experience that is to come. Then there's the actual dosing session, which people always focus on because it's the most glamorous or sensational, which is the session where you actually take the psychedelic. And that lasts anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. There's usually 2 therapists in the room with you throughout the process. And in the case of our VR scenarios or our protocols, we have a VR headset that is used there as well. And then you have your integration sessions, which are sessions of weekly psychotherapy after, where really that is the sessions, the magic happens in the dosing session, but it is in the integration sessions that the magic is actually sustained. I like to say that any experience in the present is left behind in the past unless you make an active effort to integrate it into your future. The moment it happens, it's gone, unless you actually create behavioral change from it. And that's the process of integration. And that is what the therapist takes you through. And so we utilize the VR throughout all points of the psychedelic therapy journey. It is used in preparation to help you create your intention. We have a different scenario that is used to help you on the on-ramp into the psychedelic experience. We have a different scenario that we use as a means of capturing the insights that emerge from the dosing session. And then we reuse that scenario throughout the integration sessions to help you build a sort of a mind map, a memory library of all of your insights as they have emerged from the dosing session and as they carry through to integration, such that at the end of the integration process, you have this virtual, a memory library of all of these profound insights and how they have been worked through in integration with your therapist. It's a very
That's
snapshot.
fascinating. That is incredible. And what kind of results are you seeing from the people that are? This is in a clinical trial, right? Is that what's happening?
So we're planning for a full-scale clinical trial next year. What we have run, which is the world's first study, which we did in the Netherlands, was a case study. So it was limited. There were 4 participants. It was very much a safety and validity study. And what we found, the results have been really promising. At 4, it's hard to draw statistical significance from it. But what was most interesting, I guess, if I was going to pick one metric, was that patients on applying the virtual reality headset in the days following the psychedelic experience, even without taking a psychedelic at that point, found, and I can't quote exact statistics because it hasn't been peer reviewed, and this is the scientist in me speaking, but we're talking an extremely close match, particularly to the emotional experience of that psychedelic experience. So 2 days on, 3 days on, or a week on, they're putting the virtual reality headset on, being put back into the same scenario that they were in as they were at tail end of their psychedelic trip, and they report being pulled straight back into the emotional experience of that session, which is exactly what we're trying to achieve. The whole process, which we call anchoring, is the process of creating an anchor that with which, to anchor yourself to a particular state in the past. And in this case, it's that psychedelic state which we're trying to anchor.
And you're re-triggering this by using the same images in virtual reality. Is that how that works?
By using the same images, by using the same setting, by using triggers that have been planted by the patient themselves in their own voice.
So somebody who doesn't understand what a trigger is, can you explain what that is?
Imagine when you wake up from a dream and the first 5 minutes are extremely vivid, and 10 minutes later you've got these vague memories of what might have happened, but all that raw information is gone, right? Poof, into thin air. Right. Imagine if at that point you could do 2 things. You could, 1, record exactly what it was that you had experienced while you still remembered it, and 2, create this emotional anchor such that when you put that headset back on, you were pulled right back into how you felt in those first 5 minutes after you woke up, where it was not only cognitively real, but it was emotionally real and embodied, and you were there. Wow. And that is incredibly powerful. And that whole concept of anchoring is a neuropsychological mechanism, which is it's quite poorly explored because we have very few instances where you are in an altered state of consciousness that is that profound that you have something to anchor. And dreams are often too fleeting. It's hard to conduct a clinical trial where you have someone there waiting for someone to wake up. Whereas psychedelics are a reliable and extremely profound means of creating that altered state of consciousness.
And you feel that virtual reality can help mitigate the existing barriers within current psychedelic protocols? Can you provide more information on that?
Sure. I think there are 2 problems with the way psychedelic therapy is now. And I say problems, being a bit facetious there, but I think the optimal model is not scalable, and the scalable model is not optimal. So the way psychedelic therapy happens mostly now is to fit it into the medical model of therapy, because that's what's scalable. The optimal model, which is how it's been used for centuries, which is a more retreat model, it's a nature-based scenario, it's a more shamanistic model, it requires far more immersion, is just not scalable. There are huge resource issues. Right. And for us, virtual reality is a means of, 1, increasing the optimization of that therapy, but providing a therapeutic tool that the therapist can utilize, like I said, that pulls that patient back, increases the connection and the anchoring, and also increases the scalability by, in the manner of acting as a therapeutic tool, can reduce the amount of therapist time that is required. 2, the integration process is usually quite circumscribed as being like sort of 6 to 10 sessions. It's not very long. And after that, the patients are sort of left after the end of the clinical trial. By producing over those six weeks a whole package of data, of qualitative information that they have produced for themselves, which they can then take as a package along to any therapist who wasn't even present in those during those sessions, who can then continue that integration and psychotherapy with them, because the patient comes to them with this whole virtual world where all of the insights, everything that has happened in the last 6 weeks is sort of represented and you can access. reduces the burden on clinical trials and psychedelic therapy institutions from having to provide that extended care. And it means they can provide that care to a far faster turnover of cohort of patients.
Amazing. We should back up and kind of explain that we are talking about psychedelics, but for the most part around the world, psilocybin and ayahuasca and these other kind of therapeutic psychedelics are illegal for the most part, right? In America here, we are able to, under the guise of religion, use ayahuasca, but there's nothing like that for psilocybin or for cannabis or anything like that.
Yeah, the RFRA in America is a very interesting thing. So the RFRA does
just
give...
for our audience, RFIA is?
The restricted... Oh, man, I should know this. The Restricted Freedom to Religious Use Act. Oh. I'm probably butchering that.
Oh, okay.
It's an act. It's the act in America which allows for religious exemptions to certain practices.
Right.
Because you can classify under religious use.
Here, Native Americans are able to use peyote. That's another
for example.
Right.
Or the Santo Daime Church with ayahuasca.
Right. Yes.
But as much as the RFRA allows for that, the DEA still remains very silent on the subject, which continues to place it in the gray area and continues to not, it's not something that happens with the full and thorough auspices of the law,
right.
Which is unfortunate. But
and it must be very difficult then to actually do these trials and produce this data and present it to a medical organization, all under the guise of the actual substance being illegal.
It is. It becomes incredibly tricky, resource-intensive, and expensive. I went to a research institution that was running these trials and talked about how they had to go through so many layers of permits, right, to get the drug in. And then once the substance is in the research institution, it has to be in a locked safe, which is in a double locked room, which is down a corridor which has security cameras, behind a triple locked door with a security guard. You get the whole deal in this super secure building. But you walk out of that building, you turn right, and the university campus is surrounded by a state forest, and you walk about 200 meters, and you walk into that forest, and it's sort of right there in the ground. The irony is inescapable. But having said that, the pharmaceutical grade substance is required if you want to maintain scientific integrity into the empirical method. And as much as I hate the fact that the illegality puts this many constraints on it, and that the regulatory status does, the world isn't ready for psychedelics to just be sort of flushly available everywhere. Like, these are incredibly powerful and potent substances, but as a result, also incredibly dangerous. And Alfred Nobel, when he invented gunpowder, was terrified of what the consequences would be. And sorry, I say gunpowder. I mean, I'm talking about atomic energy. And he was terrified of what the consequences would be, and justifiably so, because anything this powerful is also extremely dangerous when not wielded safely.
But now, they're really, I mean, if we look at it, in terms of, overdoses, and that doesn't really happen with psychedelics. I mean, yes, you could you could take a bunch and you could have a bad trip, and, you could need possible, medication or mental issues may arrive from that if you've really overdosed yourself. But we're not talking about like heroin or cocaine or things like where if you really, you really max out, you could be dead. That doesn't really happen with psilocybin, does it?
The psychological safety profile of psychedelics is, it's absurdly safe. It's one of the. I often think of psilocybin as the safest drug I'll ever prescribe, physiologically. There's no overdose potential. There's really no addiction potential.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah.
There's no addiction potential, right?
No, and no statistically significant in an increased rate of mental illness between psychedelic users and non-psychedelic users. This was like a 150,000 person respondent survey. However, the potential psychological harm that can be created by, and the not just psychological harm, but the risk of abuse. You're creating really vulnerable situations, Patients who are undergoing this are incredibly raw and psychologically vulnerable during that time, right? Which is why it's so efficacious. Something that can open you up that much, such that if I'm going to use really raw analogies, so you can dive in and explore your soft, mushy insides that you call your psyche, is going to leave you really raw and exposed. Which means you need an incredibly safe container. You need incredibly strong controls around those containers to ensure that this is being administered and conducted safely and properly. And research is often the first path towards sort of shepherding us into that future.
Where do you think this is all going? And how quickly can we get there?
Oh, that's a bit of a chicken and egg question. Look, money's pouring into the psychedelic ecosystem. There's in the last year alone, there was $2 billion that has been invested into just the psychedelic ecosystem. It is driving the wave of innovation, and I mean, it's a sort of benefit and a fear is that it's moved from becoming a science into becoming an industry when you talk about that much money going into it. And a fear for me is that the money will start to dictate the direction that the industry moves in, as inevitably happens when capital markets get involved. The fear is that it starts to move in the direction of a pharmaceutical model. And you see that in people trying to produce shorter and shorter acting versions of psilocybin, for example, instead of a 8-hour or 6-hour long trip, they're trying to produce even shorter versions. And these shortcuts are, while it improves the resource allocation to it, in some ways there's a reason why you don't go to the gym and do a 10-minute workout. There's a reason why you need an hour there, right? The same rule sort of applies.
Right, so but if we take, let me just ask, so because again, you didn't specify the milligram dosage that these people are experiencing, but in a very small microdose on a daily basis, acts very similar, if not better, than a Xanax, right? I know people that pop Xanax, morning, noon, and night, and still don't get that left, they still have that anxiety that they're feeling. A microdose of psilocybin can really take all of that away. And so, again, the studies that have currently been done, I'm assuming, are not microdosing.
No, so there's been some empirical research into microdosing, which remains equivocal, unfortunately. The anecdotal evidence certainly points otherwise, certainly points to enormous benefit, but the empirical
just for my American audiences?
Research-based, like academic, actual studies, doesn't support that at this point. Most of the research has been in large doses, which produce this large transcendental psychedelic effect, and what causes change. The interesting thing is that the microdose doesn't change the length of the experience; it just changes the intensity of the experience.
Right.
0.2 grams of psilocybin versus 2.5 grams of psilocybin, still the same length, just that one is barely perceptible and one isn't. Right. And one is being used more as a means of sub-perceptual optimization.
Yes.
Versus the other is used to produce this grand, self-altering experience, which you then have to work through and learn from. So they're two completely different approaches. That's and right. Jury's out on what's the best way. I just hope that as we develop this and try and scale this industry, that we stay true to the tenets of what these medicines are. Got to remember, these are nature's gifts.
Yes.
Right. Nature has evolved these over millennia.
Yes.
And there's something about the narcissistic human construct that still believes that we can do better. We can improve on this. We can adapt this molecule that nature has.
But in addition to it being natural, the human body actually has the right receptors to be able to experience the psychedelic.
Absolutely. Whether that's psilocybin or DMT or cannabis, like Rick Strassman's research into DMT and the idea that the fact that DMT is actually produced in small quantities by the pineal gland in the brain is one interesting piece of evidence. The cannabis, you have the whole endocannabinoid receptor system in the body. An interesting fact about cannabis, which I adore, this little piece of trivia, is that the neurotransmitter that transmits across the cannabinoid receptor is called anandamide. Amide because an amide is a sort of peptide protein molecule, which is what most neuroreceptors are made of, and ananda, which is the Sanskrit word for bliss.
Oh, look at that.
I'd love to meet the researcher who first discovered that and named that.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, they definitely knew what they were talking about. So can you explain the ways that Enosis is partnering with clinicians and researchers to validate technology-based solutions in therapeutic settings?
Yeah. So the studies that we ran in the Netherlands was with the Psychedelic Society of Belgium, PSBE, and Swinburne University in Australia. My research partner, Agnieszka, is also doing a PhD. This is her PhD, and that's through Swinburne University in Australia. And so that's where all of our research is channeled through that university. And we're about to embark on a bit of a road trip we're spending a month in Europe, and then about a month and a half in the US, meeting with a whole bunch of clinics and research institutions who have started to get interested in what we're able to offer. What we're hoping to offer them is a chance to utilize our product and collect data, offer this to. We want this to be offered as a therapeutic tool as soon as we can, because the sooner we can explore this at scale, the sooner we can demonstrate the benefit of the evidence.
That's fantastic. At the Real Big Things conference, you said, we can prove association, but we have absolutely no idea how to prove causality. I loved that sentence. I loved that quote. Tell me a little bit about how we can actually start to prove causality.
I was talking about understanding psychedelics and understanding how they work. And that, yes, we know that psychedelics work on the serotonin receptor. And we know that they produce these particular changes on fMRI in the brain. But that's association. We have no way of going from the substance, this pathway, to the effects. Like, we have no way of establishing that link. And I think the main thing I have to point out is that the main reason we don't understand how psychedelics work on the brain is that we have no idea how the brain works.
Right.
And so how on earth are we supposed to translate how this substance works when we still have such a rudimentary understanding of how the brain works? We'll still, even now, for most of how the brain works, or if you want to be more esoteric and really split hairs, how the mind works. The mind is the brain we understand as a physical organ. The mind is this nebulous, tenuous concept that we still remain unconvinced on whether it even has an anatomical focus.
Wait. Right? Are you making a distinction? Again, I'm not a doctor, but you're making a distinction between the brain and the mind?
The idea of a separation between body and mind, we can originate to René Descartes, which would be, what was Descartes, 15th century, who we went from monism, which is the idea of everything is one and it's whole, to the idea of dualism, the separation of body and mind. It is only because of that we have ideas of conditions like somatic disorders, which are psychological symptoms that manifest in the body. That idea only exists because we see the mind and body as separate. In the past, the fact that when you got anxious, you started sweating, we now see that as normal. Really, that's also a somatic symptom, but we've sort of indoctrinated it into a normal symptom so much. But when monism was the predominant idea, we would just have accepted that as well, that it's just a symptom of me. But now we create the distinction between mind and body. But if you want to create the distinction of mind and body, what evidence do we have that the mind, which connects us to such esoteric concepts as the ego and the soul, what evidence do we have that it actually sits physically within the brain? We don't have evidence that it is an organ, really. It is a concept. It is a portal, perhaps.
You've blown my mind. So you're saying that our self can be beyond the brain? That it's not all brain related? I'm not a therapist, so I don't really understand.
This is how I think about it. The brain is the hardware on your computer, okay, right? Which is the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, right? Okay. That's the brain. Yeah. And it's sending out signals to your bodily organs and your senses of perception. Your eyes are your webcam, your ears are your mic and speaker, right. And then your screen is where all the stuff happens, your limbs, all the actions happening. Who's operating the computer?
That is a great question. That's
remains a question. I don't have the answer for it.
Yeah, no, I think that's both that's a philosophical question, and it's also a biological question at that point. When you're doing these studies, are you mapping the brain? Are you seeing, movement and we always, here in America, we always look at these brain scans and what lights up red and what lights up orange and what's going on and all that stuff. Are you doing that during these studies to kind of understand the receptors, the parts of the brain that are actually working?
We are not looking. I mean, that's a whole other field of research. There's definitely psychedelic research. Robin Cart-Harris and his team, which used to be at Imperial College in London and have now moved to across the Atlantic to UCSF. They did a lot of that. I mean, his team did a lot of the initial research into looking at fMRI changes in the brain to map. And this is some of the bits of evidence which I described as association without really clearly being able to prove causality. But like fascinating results that emerge from that, including, one of his big theories is it's called the entropic theory of the brain. The idea that in the psychedelic state, what they demonstrated is that the psychedelic state increased brain entropy. So in the normal state, in a resting state, in a sober state, a non-psychedelic state, you had particular brain fMRI, which is functional MRI, which showed the brain tracts that were most active and had blood flow running through them, showed these very distinct tracts. And then under the psychedelic state, it just showed chaos, entropy. Sort of the tracks were all over the place. It was highly disorganized.
Wow.
Which on first glance, you might go, well, I mean, that doesn't sound necessarily very productive if it's showing entropy and anarchy or cognitive anarchy. But if you really think deeper into it, this is an analogy that's also sometimes used to make sense of this for the psychedelic space. That imagine at the end of the day going down a ski slope. And numerous people have used this analogy. It's not mine. You end up having these very worn paths in the snow where everyone has gone down. And invariably, you end up falling into one of those furrows, and that's what you go down. That's sort of your brain after 30 years of developing habits and recurrent behaviors. You do the same thing. Like you've all got your habits. You brush your teeth in the same way. You perceive states in a very similar way because that's how humans do, right? That's how our top-down processing guides us. We have these preconceived ideas which have developed over time. You can think of psychedelics as being like an avalanche that comes down and wipes that snow clean. All those furrows are gone. And so if you imagine the first hour of new skiers coming onto a slope after an avalanche, it looks a bit like the entropic brain. There are all these new pathways that are being triggered off. And what that means is that you end up finding new pathways of getting to your endpoint. Ways that you used to think that, completely new methods of thinking, completely new methods of viewing a situation. Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception, called it the Doors of Perception because the term Doors of Perception comes from a poem by William Blake in 1798, where he writes, "When the doors of perception are cleansed, man will see the world for what it truly is, infinite, for he sees the world through the narrow chinks of his cavern." By which he meant we all have these perceptual filters with which we see the world. And when those are cleansed, when those are opened, and we're suddenly perceptible to a far wider range of perceptual stimuli, we will see the world for what it truly is, which is akin to sort of wiping that slate clean and opening our eyes to multiple new ways of seeing things.
Depression is concern about the past. Anxiety is concern about the future. And so with PTSD, if you're taking psilocybin, if you're taking something that is kind of wiping away those anxiety pieces of your past, and if you're suffering from future concerns, it gives you new ways and new connections to be able to understand how to move forward in those scenarios, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And the one other nuance, that's a great quote, and I'm going to steal it from you now.
Please, go ahead.
The bit that I see is what's missing in that is there's no mention of the present, right?
Well, to be
And that's
in the present is to be
there we
okay.
to be yes. And that's
Right.
often what is missing, particularly in most of our lives, and certainly in the depressed individual. Yes, it's worry about it's concern about the past and worry about the future. What was the line again? It was what
So
about the
it's
past?
so it's. I think you could probably look this up. Please don't quote me directly.
Sure.
This is okay.
Yes.
But my understanding is, and maybe this is a friend of mine who's been in therapy, and this is what he said to me. But depression is concerns about the past.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety is concerns about the future.
About the future.
And to be in the present means that you're okay. So
Yeah.
to live in the present means that you are not suffering from either anxiety or depression.
Yes. And being present is what most of us struggle with.
Yes.
And honestly, so much of the psychedelic experience is about keeping you rooted in the present. I don't know if you've heard anecdotal stories about people who have taken psychedelics and talk about getting lost in a flower for half an hour or getting lost in a leaf for half an hour. Yes, there's a certain hallucinatory element to why that is so fascinating, but a huge part of that is presence. Yes. Just being able to be present and appreciate the beauty in the very simple geometry of a leaf, the veins of a leaf.
Yeah.
It's presence. Yes. And there is beauty all around us, absolutely all around us. Our lives are absolutely fantastic.
Beautiful. Yes.
But yet, the lack of capacity to be present is one of the primary detrimental factors in us being able to appreciate that.
Yes, yes. As somebody who has myself microdosed, I can tell you that my experience on the days that I do microdose, and I know that this is kind of out there and wacky, but it feels like a hug from the universe. It's just something that says to me, everything's going to be okay. And that's a very in the present moment thing to think about. And that, again, is on a very microdose level. That's a 0.25 milligram pill for the morning throughout the day. And you become very, very present and not worrying about the past and not concerned about the future. It's really interesting. You also, let's move on. You also talked about synesthesia. The ability to perceive one perceptual stimulus in a completely different perceptual modality. The idea of being able to see music or taste sound. Now, I have a lot of friends. I have friends on Broadway. I have friends in the music industry. I have artist friends. And they would tell you that some of them, they do experience these synesthesia moments that are just really incredible without any drugs or any kind of prescription. That's just how they perceive them.
The idea of synesthesia is not restricted to the psychedelic space, and certainly deep meditators speak about synesthesia as being a very common experience. I think a lot of it, again, comes down to presence again, but here's another little spanner in the general psychological works that I'll throw out at you. Synesthesia only doesn't make sense. Bit of double negative there. Only doesn't make sense if you maintain the separation of perceptual senses. So if you've got this cup here, you can see that it's a black cup. You can feel that it's got a smooth edge. I can lick it and tell you that it's tasteless, right? And that's three different perceptual organs that I have that I'm using to analyze and assess and form a mental image in my head of what this thing is. The thing exists independently of my capacity to perceive it.
Right.
If I didn't have two of those senses, if I was blind, for example, then my perception of it would be different.
Right.
Right. So we see the world or appreciate the world in a particular way, guided and influenced by our perceptual organs, and therefore the capacity to perceive it in that particular way, right? Synesthesia isn't that somehow all of a sudden your ears are suddenly able to see. That's not what it is. But it is knowing that what you're hearing and being able to create a visual image of it. And the fact that your eyes may be closed at that point doesn't mean that whatever that object is that you may be hearing, that it may not have a visual quality to it. It's just that you are not able to perceive that through that sense organ at the time. Doesn't mean that doesn't exist. It's just that you're choosing a different means of interacting with it. And then you are starting to form that image in your head. All processing is a mix of top-down processing, which is your preconceived notions, and bottom-up processing, which is your actual perceptual inputs. And you're creating a sort of handshake between them to form that image. When you reduce the bottom-up inputs, when you reduce those perceptual inputs, you find other ways to try and create that image. And the idea that you can form different connections by greater presence or greater concentration to put together that image without necessarily being dependent on a certain sort of perceptual organ to help you create that is not out of the realms of the imagination.
So do you think that synesthesia could be learned? Is this a something that everybody can experience, or is it specifically people who may be more left brain oriented?
The scientist in me will jump immediately to say there isn't enough research for me to give you an opinion on that subject.
Right.
But then I sound like a politician who's hedging his bets. My thoughts on it would be that yes, it probably can be trained, but it requires enormous amount of thinking. Some people are training. Some people are more blessed in terms of their physiological wiring to be able to achieve that. But whether all of us are able to, in some way, eventually entrain ourselves to achieving that state, yes, probably. But it would require enormous control over our minds and over our perceptual organs.
Right. What led you into psychedelics? As a you started off again. Let's talk a little bit about your background, because you have is it a PhD or an MD?
An MD, yes.
In what?
An MD. So I've finished medical school. The Australian system is kind of different to the American system. You don't specialize right away. Oh. You become a more generalist junior doctor, and then you go into a residency program. And sometime in that gap between finishing medical school and picking a residency program, I fell down the rabbit hole, so to speak, of psychedelics. And there was a intense deep dive, and I was, on the path to becoming a surgical resident. That was the direction I was heading in. But after a 6-month deep dive into psychedelics, I suppose the body became a lot less interesting to operate on. I'd much rather find a means of operating on the mind.
Wow.
And which is why I did my residency in psychiatry. And particularly, my interest was always purely to work with psychedelics.
Oh, wow. Oh, so you actually took your MD degree, doubled on that. In America, we would consider that doubling up on psychology. So
no, well, psychiatry. Psychiatry is a medical residency.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with how that all works.
That's right. So I did my specialization. Some people specialize in being cardiologists, some specialize in being neurosurgeons, and I chose to specialize in psychiatry purely to work with psychedelics.
Fantastic. That's amazing. And have you what have you found in terms of the community, both from the because you're really you're right on the cusp there, right? You're right at the edge of science and medicine, and you're also right at the edge of like yogi meditation, people in the woods screaming at the moon kind of thing. How is the community that you've experienced?
Look, the hardest community to crack has been the medical fraternity, which, yes, the tables are shifting, but, I've been really strong. You quoted me speaking in 2015. In the last 2 years, that's been, all of a sudden everyone wants to talk about psychedelics. In 2015, it was a very different landscape. And to be out there speaking openly about psychedelics as a doctor was terrifying at times. So that's probably been the hardest community to crack. The psychedelic community has been open and welcome for the most part. Although starting to bring virtual reality into, for a long while, I was sitting on psychiatry sits sort of on the fringes of medicine, sort of in that border between science and art. And then within psychiatry, psychedelics certainly sits on the fringes of psychiatry. And now I find myself bringing in virtual reality, sitting on the fringes of the psychedelic community. And so I find myself on the fringe of the fringe of the fringe of the fringe, which I don't know how I keep putting myself in this position. I need to stop. But it is an interesting place to be to be sort of knocking on the door of what the future should or could be.
Yeah.
And the needle will shift. I think there's an immediate instinctive reaction of aversion to the idea of technology being brought into something that is seen in such a hallowed light as something so organic as psychedelics. But over time, I think I'm trying to convince people, we're starting to convince people that there's nothing less organic or less natural about the way, about trying to shoehorn psychedelics into a very medical model. A whitewash room in a clinic, two people staring down at you, which is how often psychedelic therapy is, how you could insert it into the medical model, is about as suboptimal as it could get. And if technology can be utilized to improve the setting, to improve the therapeutic outcomes in some way, such that it approximates closer to an optimal model, that if you can take away that sort of initial counterintuitive urge, you might find that it actually aids far more in returning it to what its original ideological roots are, than the model that we otherwise have sort of fallen into over time, because that's what's most accepted by the rest of where mental health treatment is conducted.
Wow. Well, I certainly hope that it doesn't get overrun by, pharmaceutical companies that then just dole this out without anyone and any kind of, advice. I mean, we have that here in America, right? So in Florida, one of the things that they have is when you try to go and get your medical card, is they have a doctor who will prescribe you based upon the agreed Florida regiment. And so people are walking out of doctors' offices and being told to, smoke an ounce a week and, smoke a joint an hour, or do, 250 milligrams of liquid or whatever it might be. And without any kind of that experience of what is an individual who's in their 80s, who has arthritis, taking a huge doses, what is that going to do to her? And obviously, again, she's not going to have a heart attack. She's not going to overdose. She's not going to have anything like that. But she's going to have a very difficult time. So it's that fine balance that you have to maintain between, the individual understanding what they're ingesting and where they are, who they're around, and what they're doing that day, and up against the clinical, specific number that they're supposed to be taking. And in America here, we're just obsessed with popping pills. So, you get your 30 pills for the week, for the month, and you're good to go. And if you want to take more, you take more. And if you want to take less, you take less. It's not regimented. We don't have like a regimented, and that would really be what would be required in order for this to be successful, right?
I worry about the American model sometimes. I'm in the US 2 or 3 times a year, and there's something really disturbing about sitting in a subway train and seeing ads for pills everywhere, all around you.
Oh, yeah.
And no matter how many times I'm there, how often I'm there, how much time I spend there, that's one of the things that irks me every time.
Yeah. Oh, well, you should just turn on the TV and watch, the 6:00 news and watch the amount of commercials that are pumping pills and telling you to go to your doctor and ask for this, and giving a huge list of things that this will do that could cause death and heart arrhythmia and all this different stuff. And it's, for you to be able to, walk a mile more. It's ridiculous stuff. Let's talk about Caleb and Brown.
Caleb and Brown has been my baby for about 6 years. It was a fledgling baby. Now it's definitely walking on its own 2 feet, which is excellent to know. It's founded in Melbourne, just sort of over there. I can look right into the office from my living room, or more disturbingly, they can look right into my living room. And we now have offices in London, and a global reach with about 22,000 clients around the world. It's been interesting going through a bear market again. This is my 3rd market cycle with Caleb and Brown, and it's always an interesting experience. You learn more each time. You stop panicking, I think, after your second one, which has been nice. And it's an interesting journey. The bull market, the bear markets are always a great time to build. Right? In the bull markets, we barely have time to take out the trash. And in the bear markets, you actually can build. So this is where all the interesting stuff actually happens. so we can capitalize and have better products for our clients in the bull market. So yeah, we're busier than ever, which is nice to know. The real story is I was writing a talk about psychedelics. It was a talk about cognitive liberty, the idea that one should have the freedom to think to the limits of the potential of one's mind, which is what psychedelics threaten to do. And I stumbled across the idea of fiscal liberty, which is not something I'd ever quite considered, having always lived in a first world democracy with a stable economy. I always presumed my money was my own. And it was a bit of a Wikipedia stub to article. And then I stumbled across this idea of Satoshi Nakamoto and the Bitcoin white paper. And this was in 2013. Yeah. And I started reading it, and I didn't understand most of it. It took me about 3 goes. And then I found myself down another rabbit hole. And Caleb and Brown started as a side hustle, me and my business partner. And it started as a side hustle, which then became a main hustle. And I ran that as CEO for 5 years, which is a very steep learning curve for a psychiatrist to become, CEO of a financial services brokerage. Caleb Brown was the world's first cryptocurrency brokerage. And to have grown it to the sort of size that we are now, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about entrepreneurship and business and finance, and very glad I did. And so I still sit as chairman of the board at CNB, but I stepped down as CEO about 2 years ago. It's the first dedicated cryptocurrency brokerage. So the model that Cradle and Brown have is that every client gets a personal broker, and you pick up the phone and call your broker, and who manages everything you need in the cryptocurrency space. And this is something that, if you're a client of Fidelity, you probably had access to, or if you're a client of Goldman. But for your average retail consumer, this was not something that they had access to. And that was one of the major barriers to entry for a lot of people to enter the crypto space, was that lack of education, the lack of I don't know how to do this. I'm worried that I might lose my keys. Another factor to consider, the median age of our client population is, I think, 46. Which is very different to your average cryptocurrency client. Your
Consumers are older than the average?
About 20 years older than the average. I think the average client, exchange client, is about 27 or something along that lines.
Okay.
And that's because we cater to a completely different market. We cater to a more sophisticated investor, and we cater to an investor that has perhaps less time, and wants someone to help them with the whole process. We didn't create anything radically new. I mean, the idea of having a dedicated broker managing your process is something that has existed in finance for a very long time. It just didn't exist in crypto because it's incredibly resource intensive. We have to run 24/7 operations because the market never sleeps. We service a global clientele. And so it's a hard business to get off the ground. And from the time we started it, we've constantly been asked, when are you starting an exchange? When are you starting an exchange? We adamantly we're not starting an exchange. It's the reason why we're not starting an exchange. We're not trying to compete with Binance and FTX and the rest. The world doesn't need another crypto exchange.
Let me ask you, who holds the keys?
You mean the coins? So we use an external custody provider, but the clients have the option of either taking custody themselves, which some clients do, or of leaving custody with us.
That's interesting.
And we use an external insured custody provider,
where the key is kind of like double-faced, where the client has to be able to put in some of the information as well.
Yes. So we don't have we wouldn't have the capacity to freely utilize a client's assets.
Okay, that's fantastic. Because as you know, a lot of the exchanges, not your keys, not your coins.
Absolutely.
And so let me ask you, so if I called up a broker from Caleb and Brown and I said I wanted to buy 10,000 shares of, I could say like SHIB or Dogecoin or even something, shittier than that, is high risk, super high risk. Are
Yeah.
you going to dissuade me? Are you going to educate me on why I shouldn't invest in that? Or are you just going to go ahead and say, yes, let's do it?
Look, the short answer is our primary limitation is regulation, and the capacity that we don't want to be giving financial advice. Crypto is still in this gray line of financial advice,
yes.
And we adamantly do not want to cross that line. We're a legitimate player. We're not trying to undercut the regulatory landscape, which we see as incredibly useful. And we're currently working with the regulators, particularly here in Australia, on how we can better cross that line to offering that advice. What we aim to do as far as possible is to prevent our clients from making bad decisions. But we certainly are not going to overstep the mark and to try and try and get you to make what we perceive to be good decisions, because that is a very subjective notion, that latter, and that is a trap that is very easy to fall into until we've gotten ourselves to the point where we have regulatory safety to be giving official financial advice.
Right.
But we do try to provide as much education as possible, because we do see a moral responsibility to help our clients to not make flagrantly bad decisions.
Right.
I think there's a consumer protection principle that comes in there.
And to also not panic. That's really the biggest thing when you go into crypto. I mean, as somebody who went through the .coms, right? So I'm old enough to have been in the pre-.coms, post.com, and .com, that whole thing.
Yeah.
So, the idea that your investment today, if you're trying to put in $100 and make $1,000, that's high risk. If you're putting in $100 today and 10 years from now you want to get out $1,000 and it wound up to be $10,000, $100,000, $1 million, that's fantastic. But the jumping on and off that we are seeing that is affecting the sway of the market is really detrimental to the industry as a whole. So you have these conversations with your clients and kind of hold their hands and explain to them the bigger picture, even as we went from a bull market to a bear market.
Absolutely. And this, that's what the brokers are on the phone constantly. And some of them talk to me about, Prash, I don't know if I'm a broker or just a crypto friend sometimes. Some of my clients just call me because they just want to have a yarn and they don't have anyone else to talk to about crypto. I'm like, well, that's our role. That's also our role. That is absolutely our role, right? It's a slow education process, which is what makes our client a smarter client, a better client. And the other thing with this whole jumping in and out, I think there is something to be said about that additional barrier between someone making impulsive decisions and having to talk to someone who you trust as the intermediary between those decisions. I think is a very valuable step. Not to mention having taking away the risk of accidentally doing something wrong, not storing your keys, your coins safely. There are a number of distinct benefits to why we use a bank rather than shoving our money under the mattress. And that's exactly how Caleb & Brown functions.
And can Americans utilize Caleb & Brown, or is it purely an Australian company?
Yes, we have a global client base. With the bulk of our clients are spread across North America and Australia. And Europe.
Is there a minimum dollar usage, minimum dollar to get in?
There is. Our general minimums, they're not that high. It's about $10,000 per client. So we have tiers of brokerage depending on service, I guess, depending on the client. But the lowest barrier of entry is $10,000.
That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Prash, thank you so much for this time. I mean, you're a doctor. You're working in the psychedelics. You're running Caleb & Brown. The fact that you have an hour to speak to me is amazing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
We got a lot of information out of this. This was really great. I really appreciate you doing this. What time is it in Australia?
It's 9 in the morning.
9 in the morning. Well, it's 7 o'clock at night here. So thank you so much. This has been great.